Good morning. The first item of business today is general questions. Our first question from Shona Robison.
To ask the Scottish Government what information it has regarding the impact of universal credit on food banks in Scotland in light of the Trussell Trust reporting an increase in its distribution of emergency supplies.
Cabinet Secretary Shirley-Anne Somerville.
Universal credit takes money out of the pockets and food out of the mouths of some of the most vulnerable people in Scotland. And only last week, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty said that food bank use was up almost 400% since 2012, and food banks should not be stepping in to do the UK Government's job. The Trussell Trust has also linked universal credit with an increase in demand for food banks, which is up 52% where universal credit has been rolled out. The Scottish Government has written to the new Secretary of State for Work and Pensions to repeat our calls for the rollout of universal credit to be halted as a matter of urgency.
Shona Robison.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer? Would the Cabinet Secretary join me in commending the invaluable work of food banks in Dundee, which have been stretched to capacity with the increasing impact of what the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty has now called universal discredit, which has seen a 34% increase in food bank usage and a staggering increase of rent arrears by 54% across Dundee since last year. So will the Cabinet Secretary agree with me that the Chancellor's claim that we've reached the end of austerity is simply not credible, given these figures and the recent scathing UN report which utterly condemns these failures?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I would, of course, commend the hard work that goes on in our communities who are supporting each other through exceptionally difficult times and in times of crisis. But it is shameful that the UK Government continues to look the other way, despite the mounting evidence and even an intervention from the UN. I highlighted the impact of universal credit in food banks in my original answer, and COSLA evidence shows that average arrears for those in universal credit are 2.5 times average the arrears on those that are housing benefit. The evidence is clear and the evidence is simple that universal credit is causing stress, anxiety, increased rent arrears and increased debt across Scotland. That's why it must be stopped and stopped now.
Question number 2 from David Torrance.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government how accessible universal credit is for people with profound and multiple learning disabilities.
Cabinet Secretary Shirley-Anne Somerville.
Universal credit's digital by default approach makes it inaccessible for many people, and of course this may be a particular issue for those with profound learning disabilities and their families and carers. The result of the DWP's own survey, in fact, shows that only 54% of claimants can make a digital claim unassisted. It is yet another example of universal credit failing the people who need it most and putting people at risk of not being able to access the financial support that they are entitled to. It is therefore vital that this and the many other issues with universal credit are addressed before millions of people are migrated over to universal credit beginning next year.
David Torrance.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. Cabinet Secretary, Adam is 18, blind, has no mobility, no means of communication, no capacity to make a decision, is fed by means of a G-tube and requires support to keep his airways open. Yet he and his mother have had to endure an interview, complete a multitude of forms and even obtain a sick note from his GP. They have just learned that he may also have to attend an assessment to evaluate his work capability. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that this inhumane system is causing untold distress and anguish to the most vulnerable within our society and should be halted immediately by this uncaring Tory government?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think the member speaks very eloquently about universal credit, and I'm very sorry to hear about the situation that Adam finds himself in through absolutely no fault of his own. I'm sure members across the chamber will hear equally awful stories in their own surgery as individuals are forced through what is, quite frankly, an inhumane system. And the example of Adam has brought that to the chamber once again today. As I said in my answer to Shona Robison, there is absolutely no doubt that universal credit is failing some of the most vulnerable people in our society, Adam included. That is why we have written to the various Home Secretaries for Work and Pensions that we have had over the past 18 months. I wrote again to Amber Rudd this week outlining the fundamental flaws of universal credit and particularly the digital by default example of that. That, for many other reasons, is why I have called once again on the Secretary of State to halt the rollout of universal credit.
Question number 3, Bill Kidd.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what its response is to the findings of the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights following his 2-week inquiry into rising levels of poverty and the consequences of austerity measures.
Cabinet Secretary Aileen Campbell.
The Scottish Government welcomed the UN Special Rapporteur's visit to the UK. Professor Alston's end-of-visit statement is a devastating critique of the UK Government's punitive, mean-spirited and often callous policies and the suffering and hardship that they have caused. The Scottish Government echoes Professor Alston's call for the UK Government to stop denying the evidence. The hard reality is that 1/5 of the UK population lives in poverty. Last year, 1.5 million people were reduced to destitution, and that is an absolute scandal. And yet again, a UN expert has laid bare the UK Government's failures to guarantee the most basic of human rights, food, shelter, dignity to millions of its own citizens.
Bill Kidd.
I thank the Minister for that reply. And does she agree that integrating human rights into and throughout Scottish Government policy, a direction that is the polar opposite of the Tory UK Government's take on politics, will build an increasingly equitable society?
Cabinet Secretary.
Rights are at the heart of everything that we seek to do as the Scottish Government, with all public authorities now having a duty to respect, protect and fulfil human rights. And that's why our own new National Performance Framework now has an explicit human rights outcome supported by 31 human rights indicators. And it's why we're taking practical action to implement Scotland's international human rights obligations. For example, Scotland's new social security system embeds human rights in its core legislative principles, and these principles go much further than just simply warm words. Every aspect of the new system is being developed in partnership with rights holders, and we're designing a public service that meets their needs from the outset. A glimpse of an approach that Scotland can take if given the power and responsibility to deliver for the people of our country. And they stand in complete contrast to the policies of the UK Government, which keeps its head buried in the sand about the everyday misery, hardship and despair that it continues to cause.
Elaine Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Is the Cabinet Secretary aware that the devastating impact of UK Government policies on women's lives have been given specific attention by the UN Rapporteur's report, with women selling sex in order to pay for food and shelter, women as the vast majority of single parents facing significant hardship with the two-child cap, and women making up the majority of pensioners, many of whom are living in poverty. In addition, Philip Alston specifically mentions the Scottish Welfare Fund, and of the thousands of households in Scotland receiving help from it, 54% were single people and 22% were single parents, but none of the Scottish Government data tells us if these are men or women. So why is the data not disaggregated by sex, disability or race to allow for more informed analysis of the take-up and reach of the Scottish Welfare Fund to ensure it's actually contributing effectively to tackling the poverty which is faced by a disproportionate number of women in Scotland?
Cabinet Secretary.
Absolutely, and Elaine Smith is right to point out the gendered impact of UK welfare reforms and austerity, and the impact, the devastating impact, the tragic, heartbreaking impact that it's causing to too many women across Scotland and the UK. And of course we'll seek to always do what we can around the Scottish Welfare Fund to ensure that it can meet the needs of the people of Scotland, the people that it's designed to help in the face of these cuts that we are facing. I would point out that we're spending £125 million this year to mitigate the UK cuts, and by 2020-21, 3.7 billion will be cut from the social security budget. But that is really difficult to sustainably always mitigate. But certainly where we can improve, and there was recommendations for us in the Scottish Government to make improvements to the way we cope with these welfare reforms to ensure that we can better improve the system in Scotland, and certainly will continue to engage with Elaine Smith on those particular issues she raised around the gendered impact on welfare and reforms and austerity. And
Gillian Martin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Continuing on that theme, the UN Special Rapporteur said that limiting benefit payments to 2 children was as, and I quote, forced and physical as China's one-child policy. What does the Cabinet Secretary make of his assertion that the UK welfare system is as sexist as if it were compiled by a room full of misogynists? That's his words. And how could she outline if all welfare were devolved to this place, what would the Scottish Government do differently as a priority?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, we certainly wouldn't have a rape clause, we certainly wouldn't have a 2-cap child limit, and certainly what I said and outlined to Bill Kidd in my response, the social security system that we have built in Scotland that has been designed around dignity, respect and fairness gives a glimpse of what is possible when Scotland has the ability to cope and care for its people. That is one way we are currently delivering for the people of Scotland, and if we had the full powers and competencies to make sure that we could care for everybody in our country, then we would deliver a system that didn't have things like the inexcusable rape clause policy in this country.